I made it my mission to reform the missions board, which was one of the largest in America. I just knew most church members, if they found out, would be scandalized. And I thought on my own I could organize a pitchfork revolution in which the peasants would storm Dracula's castle and fix the missions board and hopefully reform and renew the whole United Methodist Church. It didn't quite work out that way, but I think I did play some role in the Orthodox resurgence within Methodism that continues to unfold and which saved us from the implosion that afflicted other mainline denominations.
Well, good day, folks, and thank you for joining us here on the Public Square and everything in it. I like to think of this video cast as the thinking person's alternative to watching e-news. And today it's our pleasure to welcome Mark Tooley to the show. Mark is the president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C., and has been since 2009. The IRD encourages America's denominational traditions to remain faithful to apostolic teaching in ways that are especially pertinent to current circumstances. So they do a lot of cultural criticism, work in public policy, applying Christian thought to public policy, especially national security issues and foreign policy, but certainly not limited to that. Now, prior to being the president of the IRD, Mark worked for 8 years for the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. We'll get him to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. He's a graduate of Georgetown University. I guess we're not surprised that somebody who went to Georgetown also wound up at the agency, and great university. It's a really interesting life story that President Tooley has. He has been active in the United Methodist Renewal since the 80s, when he actually wrote a study about denominational funding of pro-Marxist groups. And as it turns out, President Tooley is not a Marxist, and that bothered him. He attends the United Methodist Church in Arlington, Virginia. He's the editor of Providence Magazine, which is a very interesting magazine. You should order it right now. Jot it down. A journal that addresses foreign policy, national security issues from a Christian perspective. He oversees the IRD's website, which is theird.org. President Tooley, Mark, welcome to the show.
Bruce, great to be with you.
Yeah, so let's start out. If you will, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you come to have Christian convictions? And maybe even a little bit about what brought you to the CIA. So just a little bit about your life story.
Yes, I grew up in a medium-sized Methodist church outside Washington, D.C., where I came to faith and grew in the faith, for which I'm always grateful. And I also grew up outside Washington, D.C. During the Cold War, which really captivated my imagination. And I've always been an enthusiast for American democracy. And so I went to Georgetown and studied international relations with the idea that I would be a participant in the Cold War, working either at the State Department or the CIA for the rest of my professional life. Of course, I worked for the CIA as a young man, but had not factored in that the Cold War may actually end. Very few people expected that at the time. And so wonderfully, the Cold War did end peacefully, and I was still a young man with not a lot to do in my government job. But it turns out that I had a different vocation that was developing, in that I became increasingly involved in Methodist church politics, starting as a college student, going to church conventions. And as you referenced, there were some very disturbing aspects to the Methodist church bureaucracy, theologically and politically. And so it became my vocation to work with others for the reformation of the United Methodist Church across the last over 30 years.
Well, you know, that's fascinating. We're going to come back to that in a moment, your work with the Methodist Church, but I'd like to start out with Institute on Religion and Democracy. You've invited me there, participated in several events. I like what you do. You were founded in the early 80s, 1981, I believe. Could you tell us a little bit about why it was founded?
Well, again, a very different era. That was still very much Cold War time. And during the 1970s and 1980s, although this is almost unimaginable to many people today, but many of the great church denominations, which are not so prominent anymore, and the ecumenical councils to which they belong, which again are almost forgotten or non-existent today, but were then very influential and very enmeshed in what was called liberation theology, under which they felt that the gospel was best expressed in solidarity with the poor by backing Marxist liberation movements, often violently sometimes, to overthrow what were deemed to be unjust regimes, to establish more equitable social and economic structures. So, for example, the mainline churches and the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches were all very involved in supporting the Sandinista Marxist regime in Nicaragua, starting in 1979 through the 1980s, as an example of God's kingdom breaking forth. And the IRD was founded to combat the influence of liberation theology in the churches and to make a Christian case for democracy, human rights, and especially religious freedom for all.
Yeah, so you've mentioned several times the context in the 1980s, and it was different. I grew up, with the Cold War being central to my memory. We grew up praying for a concentration camp, folks in concentration camps, pastors, Baptist pastors, and lay people who were put into the gulag. And things have changed since then. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you think Christian political witness has changed since the 1980s, and how you approach things differently today, how the IRD approaches things differently, and by extension, how we as Christians as a whole need to realize that we're in a different moment than we were in the 1980s?
Well, when the Cold War ended successfully and peacefully, there were some at the IRD who said we should simply declare victory and shut down. But there were others who prevailed that said, no, there are other battles meriting our attention. So in the 1980s, we became enmeshed in the struggles within the mainline Protestant denominations over sexuality. Of course, traditionalists backing the biblical stance on marriage and revisionists on the opposite side. Almost all of those battles were lost, and almost all of the mainline Protestant denominations, except among the United Methodists. As that unfolded, and the mainline Protestant world was becoming less and less important, there was a growing, emerging evangelical left, which IRD especially began to address in the early 2000s, and which is even more, I think, formidable today, in that seemingly more and more evangelicals, perhaps without any sense of history, want to repeat the same mistakes that the mainline Protestants made in the 20th century. So I think IRD is uniquely positioned to warn those tempted by the evangelical left that, no, we know this will end badly. Cleave to theological orthodoxy, cleave to a thoughtful political and social witness that avoids utopianism and statism.
Yeah, we were talking on a previous show, I think last week, with Daniel Mahoney, American political philosopher, those of you who are out there watching. And there really is a movement on the left and with some people on the right to sort of locate society's evils in entirely in institutions rather than in people's hearts. And the two worst institutions for many of these folks are the nation state and the church. And if we can just get rid of strong forms of religion and strong forms of the nation state, then war and evil will kind of go away, and we can take a great leap forward. And it is a kind of a utopian way of looking at things. And I love that we've got folks like you who are pushing back against that, because it's an awful way to look at things. I mean, nation states and religions are the very things we need to give us identity, to shape us, and make us who we are. So you've been involved, and you've referenced already a couple of times today, in a lot of sort of church controversies. And the IRD is affiliated with people from a number of different traditions. For you, it's been the Methodist Church. How did that start? What was your first foray?
Well, my own personal experience is almost in sync with how IRD was created, in that as a young man, I discovered how the Methodist Church bureaucracy, like other mainline churches, was, again, enmeshed in liberation theology to the extent they were making large grants of large amounts of cash to groups that were essentially pro-Marxist and in solidarity with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, with the Marxist guerrilla insurgency in El Salvador, with then Marxist insurgency in the Philippines and elsewhere, while also effectively supporting the position of the Soviet Union on many issues, and in the interest of good relations with the Soviet Union, most scandalously going silent on human rights abuses behind the Iron Curtain, and even the persecution of Christians behind the Iron Curtain. When I discovered that as a missions chair in my local church as a very young man, I was so scandalized I made it my mission to reform the missions board, which was one of the largest in America. I just knew most church members, if they found out, would be scandalized. And I thought on my own I could organize a pitchfork revolution in which the peasants would storm Dracula's castle and fix the missions board and hopefully reform and renew the whole United Methodist Church. It didn't quite work out that way, but I think I did play some role in the Orthodox resurgence within Methodism that continues to unfold, and which saved us from the implosion that afflicted other mainline denominations like the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church USA.
You know, it is just so intriguing, and so intriguing that Christian leaders will be drawn to Marxism. And for those of you watching the video cast today, so many different denominational traditions over the past 50 to 100 years have been drawn to Marxism. Marxism is an imminent form of salvation. It offers a salvation from within this world. And so it's a competitor to Christianity. It's got a deterministic view of human beings. It promises liberation, economic and social liberation, but what it always does is suppresses society and induces poverty. It's been an absolute disaster historically. And I think I want to remind you again out there that if a theory of any sort arises out of atheistic soil, it will be wildly skewed, even if it does have some good insights here and there about this, that, or the other. So always beware of theories that grow out of atheistic soil. Folks, we're going to take a break for a moment. Don't leave us. Right after the break, we're going to discuss some very interesting things. We're going to talk about divisions within the church, both political and doctrinal. We're going to talk about America's foreign policy and some national security issues. And then finally, what are some of the biggest challenges for Christian political witness in the future? We might have a bonus question about what it's like to work at the CIA. So don't leave us, and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes.
Hi there, friends. Thank you for joining me on The Public Square and Everything in It. Now, in case you're a person who's interested in further studies, I want to take a moment to talk with you about our D-Min program. Now, if you enter the D-Min program here at Southeastern, your studies will be facilitated by world-class faculty, and you will find yourself connected to a community of very sharp D-Min students who are serving as pastors, missionaries, counselors, teachers, many other ministry positions. Our D-Min programs are designed to produce students who are especially sharp and whose studies will enhance their ministries. For example, you might be interested in the D-Min in Faith and Culture. This D-Min track trains a student in theology, ethics, and apologetics. It's designed to help career ministers develop a deeper understanding not only of the Bible, but of our cultural context, so that the student can more effectively bring the gospel into an interface with our secular age. Now, if you're interested in applying for the D-Min or taking a look at our academic catalog, you can visit us at apply.sebts.edu, or you can email us at admissions@sebts.edu.
All right, and we are back. We are talking with Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. We've been having a great discussion about Christian witness in the 80s during the Cold War, and Mark's involvement in church controversies in the 80s and 90s. And we're going to switch now. We're going to still talk about the church for a moment, and then we'll switch back to talking about American foreign policy and some national security issues, Mark's time at the CIA, and so forth. But I just wanted to say, you know, over the last few decades, many of America's longstanding denominations have experienced conflict over doctrine. The Anglican Communion has had a fracas that's been playing for decades now. It's been very public. A lot of Presbyterian denominations have also. My own Southern Baptist Convention has had just sort of feel like, you know, multiple different types of controversies over the past 50 years. And United Methodists are no exception, right? So can you talk to us a little bit about the unfolding schism in the Methodist Church? You've got probably at least half of our audience is Baptist. We do have a broader view than that, so some of our folks may not know as much about what's going on. Can you encapsulate it for us?
Well, United Methodism, of course, is the it's the third largest religious body in America after Catholicism and the Southern Baptist Convention. It's also the largest mainline Protestant denomination, and the mainline isn't so mainline anymore, but the mainline began its long decline in the early 1960s. So 55 years ago, 1 out of every 7 Americans belonged to a mainline Protestant denomination. Today it would be 1 out of every 30, and fast spiraling downward. But almost all the mainline denominations liberalized on sexuality, starting with the Episcopal Church in 2003 when it elected its first openly, actively homosexual bishop, followed by the Presbyterian Church USA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. But the United Methodist Church never compromised or watered down its biblical teachings on marriage because of the growing membership in Africa. So the other mainline denominations were almost all U.S. based, but United Methodism was international. And so currently close to half of its membership is in Africa, where Christianity is very orthodox and conservative. So thanks to African delegates at our quadrennial governing conventions, our biblical stance on sexuality has been continuously reaffirmed across recent decades, to the great exasperation of church liberals who just assumed that Methodism would follow the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians and the Lutherans in liberalizing on sexuality. So we had our final showdown last year at a specially called general conference that was to focus exclusively on sexuality, and which the liberal side of the church just assumed that with the backing of the U.S. church bureaucracy and bishops, that their side would prevail. And to their great shock and horror, thanks to the African delegates, Filipinos, East Europeans, and American evangelicals, the liberals were defeated, and biblical teaching was not only reaffirmed last year, the penalties for violation of, say, performing a same-sex union were enhanced. As a result of that conservative success, the church is now on the verge of a schism, and there's a growing consensus for dividing the United Methodist Church. In fact, this week that would have already happened. Our governing convention was scheduled to meet this week, but was postponed till next year because of the pandemic. Yeah. But almost certainly late next year, there will be not one, but at least 2 great Methodist churches, one liberal and one traditional.
It's been interesting to watch all of this play out and to see the positive role African churches have played, not only in the United Methodist communion, but also in the Anglican communion. The Lambeth Conference years ago, when the African bishops spoke boldly and stood on the side of fidelity to God's word. And Christianity started in North Africa, folks, and in the Middle East, and it's returned home. And so we're grateful for that. Let's switch now. We've talked about church controversies and divisions, and I want to switch back to your other hat that you wear, which is you're a public Christian. You're a public theologian, if you will, and you speak to issues at the intersection of Christianity, politics, and public life, matters of national interest. I want to talk about America. So I think it feels to me like many or most of the intellectual elite, the elite power brokers in America at our universities and our thought leaders, many of them kind of poo-poo our nation. It's and just speak badly of it often. And then on the other hand, you've got some people that tend to elevate the country to almost the level of the Church of God, that it's America that saves the world instead of the church saving the world. What's a good perspective? How should American Christians view our nation?
Well, a very important and wonderful question, and the attempt to answer that question for American Christians was one reason in 2015 that we founded Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. Initially, the motivation for founding it was out of concern for the growing influence in American Christianity, Protestant and evangelical, by what I call neo-Anabaptists, who, as you referenced, dismiss the need for the nation state altogether, review it as intrinsically idolatrous and not of concern to Christians. But also, as you say, after I founded Providence, there was a growing awareness that Christians on the conservative side have their own issues, whereas the great Protestant traditions fade in memory, and increasingly post-denominational American Christianity, there's less and less connection to the great traditions of political theology once offered to us by the Reformed, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, and others. And so Providence and IRD are attempting to reconnect American Christians, especially in their post-denominational mode, to some of those great traditions so we can understand God's purposes for nation states, and especially, and this would offend many, but God's purposes for America, because God has purposes for all nations.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for the magazine. You know, the Catholic tradition has a long and storied and tradition of deep thinking about the interface of Christianity and politics, but many or most evangelical churches don't and have not given sustained reflection to those things. And so if you're out there watching and you're a person who wants to cultivate the life of the mind, I recommend highly to you Providence Magazine. So Mark, what is, in your opinion, what are the biggest challenges we have for Christian political witness in the future? Like, the upcoming decade, 2 decades.
Well, I think the core of the issue is American Christians don't understand God's purposes for the nation state or for government. And we have wonderful traditions within Christianity describing God's purposes for government that are largely unknown to contemporary American Christians. And so we have a growing segment of American Christians, especially among elites on the left, who are increasingly statist and who believe that every command in the New Testament for generosity and sharing applies directly to the federal government of the United States of America, which supposedly has a universal calling to meet the material needs of all people everywhere at all times from their perspective. And there are also Christians on the conservative side who perhaps are overly libertarian and perhaps only see the government's justified purposes and through its police and military functions, and therefore should be hands off. But I think the problem across the spectrum is American Christians are simply mostly following contemporary partisan preferences with very few deep theological roots.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that for a moment with everyone who's out there listening today. I think it's very, very important what Mark just said. For Christians to view the Bible's overarching narrative as a true story of the whole world, and to let that master narrative be the narrative that informs our thinking about the interface of our Christian witness in public life. So we should not take the narrative, the dominant narrative of any secular cable network or any political pundit, and let it be the master narrative, and then have the Bible's narrative be kind of a bit player in the midst of the narrative that is really controlling the way you think. And I think that it's more difficult than you might think, that if you have exposed yourself to radio talk shows, political talk shows, cable news networks over and over again, a lot of times what happens is you have secular partisan politics shaping the way you think. And so this is what we want to make our way past that. We want to listen to a good number of Christian thinkers who can help us do that. So I have one last question. We've got to wrap up in a second, a bonus question, just a fun question. What was it like to work at the CIA?
Well, it was very exciting to me as a young man in the late 1980s. I began when I was still in college in 1986, and the notorious, legendary Bill Casey was still director, and I was thrilled just to see him driving on his way to work across the Potomac River as I walked to class at Georgetown. He seemed so imposing and mysterious. I recall a party at the CIA headquarters when the Soviet Union announced it was withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. And in retrospect, that was very momentous and signified the impending end of the Cold War, which was great news for the world, but it wasn't so great news for all of the employees in the intelligence world who had been focused on the Cold War conflict for decades. As mentioned, I just assumed that was going to consume the rest of my professional life. So when the Cold War ended, there were a lot of us who had less and less to do during the course of the day. The Persian Gulf War reignited the world a little bit, but that was fortunately a rather brief world. And so by the time I left in 1994, it was time to leave, and I moved on to my next vocation. But I learned a lot from my time there in terms of communication and how to, in terms of transmitting direction and analysis, how to communicate succinctly and factually, and just how the government operates behind the world. It inoculated me forever against conspiracy theories and the assumption that somehow, somewhere, there are people in control who know what they're doing. Very rarely are there people in control and know what they're doing. Instead, human history is moving forward haphazardly, and people are responding to events as they unfold. And as Christians, we know God is sovereign, but everyone else is pretty much just reacting.
Well, that is fascinating, and I think it's very relevant to our current era. There's so many conspiracy theories on the internet right now. I don't even know where to start. But Mark, this has been a great interview. Thank you for coming on the show today. For those of you who are watching, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to encourage you to go visit theird.org. That's the Institute on Religion and Democracy. It's their website. And then also to subscribe to Providence Magazine, which will help you grapple with foreign policy, ethics of warfare, national security issues, and consistently does so in an interface with the Christian faith. So we hope you'll join us again soon on The Public Square and Everything in It. Take care. Have a great day.